just to reiterate that we are recording this conference in order to produce a comprehensive document at the end of it. Can I welcome everybody? This is going to be a fast-moving conference, rebooting education, developing an agenda for change. There are many issues to be covered, and we'll touch on a number of them. Just to say, my name is Melian Mansfield, and I'm chair of CASE. Welcome to you all and to the speakers today. Every child has the right to an education which develops their interests, their talents, and enables them to enjoy a rich number of experiences. Currently, the education system needs a lot of change to achieve that. So we need systemic change and an holistic approach, because the whole system is very fragmented. We have invited 14 speakers, all with expertise in their field, who will talk for 5 minutes about their proposals for change. We're covering 4 key themes: fragmentation, professionalism, inclusion, and curriculum. After each group of speakers, there will be an opportunity for other members on the call to put forward a comment or a question, but you will only have 1 minute to do that, after which you will be muted. At the end of each section, each of the 4 sections, there will be a summary of the key points. And at the end of, and there are 4 sections, at the end of the conference, we will summarize everything that has been said and afterwards produce a document providing an agenda for change. So I'm going to pass over to Tom Mann to introduce the section on fragmentation.
Morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Tom Mann. I'm Treasurer of CASE. The first section we have this morning is entitled Fragmentation, and our first speaker is Cole Parsons, Emeritus Professor of Canterbury Christ Church University.
Sorry, Carl, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Carl, you're still muted. Button bottom left hand of the screen.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Right, fragmentation, the national picture. Our education system in England is in disarray. Not so in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, no. And the system in England is now many systems. Our national provision for the education of our young people is subcontracted and outsourced. That's for some 8 million children. That's nearly 8% of our population, nearly 1 million staff in our schools. That's teachers and support staff, costing 59 billion. This is big business. Once run by central government, but delegated within a national framework to the 160 local authorities, now a disaggregated, dismantled and chaotic collection of groupings and standalones which comprise our partially academised system. Start of 2023, there were a total of 2,400 trusts. 1,250 of them were single academy trusts, and the local authorities are in business as well. So they're all of these providers of education. 80% of secondary schools, 40% of primaries and 44% of specials or academies and local authorities look after the rest and fulfill other requirements such as special needs, looked after children, school exclusions, and so on. There is no need for this spectacularly fragmenting, undemocratic, and destructive arrangement. No gain, no improvement in results, no improved turnaround, no particular enjoyment of the supposed greater freedom. On your screen, you see Essex, which we can show up from our fragmentation tool, and I've put it in the chat so others can use it. But Essex, a big local authority, has 560 schools, nearly 3/4 of them are academies, but 98 providers, as it says in the top right-hand corner there, 99 including the local authority. Some of those MATs have schools in other local authorities too. 40 of these trusts are actually standalone academies. Some of the primary standalones with only about 300 children. This is you ought to take a look and play with this fragmentation tool. Just by comparison, but I'm not putting up anything on the screen about it. Barnet, small local authority, a London borough, has 34 providers, including the local authority, 134 schools. Only 7 of the providers are properly MATs. That's those that include 2 or more schools, and 6 of those only have 2 schools in them. So there's not much multi about it. These educate nearly half of Barnet's pupils. The majority are actually educated still by Barnet. The conclusions I draw from all this of this wasteful, incoherent, chaotic system with costs to senior management of 2,000 plus trusts replacing or duplicating 160 local authorities as follows. 1, simply return to the local authority system, or something very much like it, to reinvigorate a local democracy in educational management. Allow schools to return to local authority care and control. Ofsted failed schools not directly and automatically required to join a multi-academy trust if there is an alternative local plan. Cease the flow of schools from local authority control to MATs, a saving of the legal fees which government currently pays for each one of those transfers. Only local authorities to be able to open new schools and decide which schools close. That enables them to actually fulfill their place planning role. Discontinue the regional schools directors roles. There are 9 of them, employing 550 staff in 2022 to 2023, a projected cost of 34 million. The local authority boards can do this job. And teacher education finally should return to the universities, and we should close those organisations specifically set up unnecessarily to support academies and trusts. The Institute for Teaching, annual budget 121 million, and the Oak National Academy producing materials for schools, another 3 million. Thank you.
Well,
Spot
spot on.
Very much, Carl. Very concise and hard-hitting. Okay, our second speaker is John Galloway, and his talk is entitled "Systems Matters: Academy Management Costs." He's the vice chair of CASE.
Thank you, Tom. Excuse me. Hopefully you're all familiar with this. CASE produced it about 18 months ago. We commissioned Warwick Mansfield, the journalist, to look into the how the impact of high management costs is having an effect on classrooms. Excuse me. Now, we know the concerns about high management costs have been with us for some years. This is the Public Accounts Committee in 2018, and justifiably high salaries use public money that could be better spent on improving children's education and supporting frontline teaching staff. So 2018, 6 years ago, and that wasn't the first occasion. And successive secretaries of state have said something will happen, and education committees have said something happened. And what has happened is that it all went very quiet. So we asked Warwick to look into the costs, and what he found was quite enlightening. Now, the first thing I want to say is that there are some misconceptions that the previous government were keen for us to take on board, like, for instance, that all schools are academies. In reality, more than half of our schools are still run by local authorities, although just over half of our pupils are in academies. There's no difference in outcomes. So what Warwick did is he took the 50 largest MATs and the 10 largest local authorities, because they each educate roughly the same amount of children, 850,000. And he looked at actually what they spend on management. And unfortunately, the figures on this are a little small, but the first bar is for trusts who educate more than 10,000 children. And the figure at the top is how much per head goes into management costs. And in those trusts, £79 per child goes into management costs. And as the trusts get smaller in the number of children they educate, so the cost gets lower. So this notion that there is an economy of scale in trusts when you get a bigger trust is actually the reverse is true. The costs go up as a trust gets bigger. And down at the end there, you have local authorities at £28 per head. So that's the reality. That's the impact on classrooms of management salaries. So what can we do about it? Well, first of all, we should recognise that collaboration benefits schools. And we've always had things like federations. And certainly in my borough, Greenwich, one of the things that happened in when Gove kicked off the latest round of academisation was that several of our federations then became academy trusts. But they were already collaborating and cooperating. We also need to recognise that the academies system came in as a response to local authorities not particularly fulfilling their duties in some instances very well. Some authorities do very well. But that was the original Blair idea, and then Gove subverted it and used it as a means of introducing market forces into the education system. But we do need to recognise that whilst we're saying we prefer local authority control, that local authorities may need restructuring and rethinking. Things we could do is we could regulate trust management pay in the way that we regulate other staff. So teachers, national pay and conditions, support staff, national pay and conditions, head teachers also to a large degree in local authority schools. Now, across the country, even in MATs and academies, a lot of heads still maintain those national pay scales. But it seems to be in the large trusts where these excessive management costs come in, not exclusively, but mainly in those large trusts. So we could pin management pay to, say, civil service pay or to the pay, the local authority pay scales. So there are ways of regulating that pay. Need to reform the school governance. In a large MAT, you need only have a board of 3 people making all the decisions across the MAT. Most of them don't, but there's no single management structure for MATs, as there is more or less a regulated structure for local authority schools. As Carl has said, regional schools commissioners cost around £35 million a year. Now, if we don't have the MAT system, or if we give local authorities the powers, the place planning obligation, the power to fulfil place planning, then we no longer need those MATs. I'm going to stop there because that's my time. But I think we're all clear. You know, we are fragmented. We need to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Again, another very brief and I think hard-hitting talk. Great, some really good points made there. The next talk is by Dr. Rob Hyam from UCL, and the topic is no significant difference between LEA and MAT costs. Okay, over to you, Rob. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Yeah, actually not about MAT costs, but I'll jump in. So I at risk of blowing away my 5 minutes, I'd just like to connect from what John's report was to some of our own finding on MATs. So during an analysis period up to 2015, we found no positive MAT impact on student attainment compared to standalone academies. We also found significant differences by MAT size, and that's the read across. So students in small and mid-sized MATs tended to perform better on average than peers in comparable standalone academies and maintained schools. Conversely, secondary students in larger MATs of 16 or more schools tended to do worse than peers in comparable schools. So this suggested to us that the economic and policy drivers for rapid MAT growth at the time may well have been in tension with an educational argument for smaller, more diverse groupings of schools. That research, titled Hierarchy, Markets and Networks, also detailed from 4 locality studies various forms of fragmentation from 2010, including, to name a few, firstly, what we called chaotic centralization, which we characterized as partially overlapping organizations in the bureaucratic hierarchy, holding diverse views and completing claims to authority, but actually with diminishing local knowledge about schools. Second, an increasingly commercial middle tier with services for schools being bought and sold rather than being provided on the basis of need. And third, increasing inequalities with high status schools seen to be benefiting from new opportunities and resources, while lower status schools faced a concentration of challenges, including undersubscription, higher mobility, and disproportionate numbers of hard-to-place children. And indeed, 2/3 of our survey responses in 2016, agreed that inequalities between schools were becoming wider as a result of contemporary policy reform. So that fragmentation and inequality are influenced not only by hierarchical governance changes, but also by how quasi-markets in state education are made up, is further explored in our recent report on the impacts of free schools on their neighbouring schools. So we set out to test the chain of causation assumed in policy that the presence of a free school would increase choice and competition and thereby incentivize improvement in neighbouring schools. We found briefly neighbours did on average experience a decline in student enrolment after a free school opened and often perceived competition. Competition did predict reported action taking by neighbouring schools, but competition related particularly to actions on marketing, promotion and recruitment, and to a lesser extent on accountability-focused actions such as placing more emphasis on core subjects and student attainment in external exams, whilst competition did not predict internally focused actions relating more directly to the quality of teaching and learning. So analysing outcomes expected in policy, we estimated on student attainment in English and maths, no improvement in primary neighbouring schools on average, but a modest improvement in neighbouring secondary schools. Investigating this, we found secondary schools gaining a substantially more disadvantaged intake after a free school opened did not improve, while schools gaining a substantially more advantaged intake did, suggesting social selection was a mediator of free school competition translating into improvement in secondary schools. Analysing an outcome not expected in policy, social segregation, we found primary free schools were associated with a modest increase in social segregation locally, particularly in terms of student ethnicity. And we also identified conditions perceived to destabilise specific neighbouring schools, including where they served a deprived context, lost students due to a free school and were downgraded to below good by Ofsted just before or just after a free school opened. And this had the potential to start a cycle of decline, including by creating the need for those schools to cut staff and their curriculum. So looking across both projects, there's a range of implications for rebooting education. I want to highlight just a few that may not be touched on later. So first, we argue the government needs to reassess the assumptions it sets out on how choice and competition work in state school quasi-markets, which of course underpins so many policies. This should recognise schools rarely prioritise change and improvement and innovation in classroom practices when subjected to new market pressures. And quasi-markets also have the clear potential to incentivise selective competition, from which detrimental social outcomes can result. Second, current policy on school admissions and fair access needs to be reformed. In my mind, there's no clear basis for a school to act as its own admissions authority. And local authorities must have sufficient powers to fulfill their legal duties to arrange suitable education for all local children. Third, local services for the most vulnerable children need to be substantially rebooted. Schools have clear responsibilities here, but too many are now, in my mind, left to take on too much. So from speech and language therapy, mental health services to social services, schools need to be surrounded by really good quality and crucially accessible external service provision. And finally, as others have noted, there is a need for greater legitimacy in our school structures. Our findings highlight an increasing local democratic deficit in state education. We need a system of governance that secures greater trust and meaningful engagement for teachers, parents, and students. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. Again, really informative there. And apologies for the calling you costs and not outcomes. That was my poor notes. So just to summarise, they've got a minute here. We looked at, firstly, academies being undemocratic, wasteful, disparate and expensive. And there was a call by Carl to keep keep schools in LAs to save money and for local authorities to have place planning back and revised teacher education and also regional schools directors to go. John then talked about the high management costs of maths and no different in outcomes, even though more money was being spent at the top and less in the classroom, and a call for more collaboration, pay regulation, governance reform, to get rid of, again, school commissioners, to centralise a mission, to have LA powers in place planning and return to local authority control. And Rob's talked about the opening of free schools and the impact on the local environment and also local education environment, and also the difference between smaller and larger mats, with smaller mats performing better than larger mats generally, and free schools having an influence on competition, but mainly that competition being in place planning, in getting places into the school, in promotion, in getting teachers into school. And it was very, very rarely anything to do with the quality of teaching and learning and looking at pupil outcomes. There was no improvement in local primaries. There was a small improvement in secondary schools when free schools opened. And he talked about negative impacts locally, cutting staff and curriculum, and the impact on local schools and them being downgraded by Ofsted, and a call for fair access reform. Schools not their own admissions bodies, local action and local authorities or some local body to take action for admissions. External services to be good quality around those local schools, and there's a current local democratic deficit that needs sorting out. So really thank you very much to all our speakers on that particular topic, and I'll hand over for the second topic now.
Melian, muted.
Sorry, we are now enabling those who are on the call to make a quick comment. You have 1 minute to do so if you wish to. So I'm handing over to John to manage this.
Oh, okay.
Just call the names of anybody who wants to say something.
Well, if people can use the virtual hand, so raise your hands, and then Melian will be able to spot who'd like to come in. And there was a lot of ground covered there. There were some similar calls, and I could have listened. Well, I would not to listen to me more, but certainly the evidence that Rob had was enlightening. Sadly.
So, does anyone wish to make a comment or ask a question? I don't see any hands. Do you, John?
I've got Michael Freeston.
Michael.
Hi, Melian. Hi, John. Thanks. We were talking about fragmentation. Could I ask Rob to explain a bit more what he said about chaotic centralisation? Because it was a phrase I hadn't heard before, and that would seem to potentially be a risk if we're moving away from fragmentation, or have I misunderstood?
We're going to ask people to speak at the end. I'm just giving a few minutes for anyone to make comments. Okay, so, Rob, perhaps you'll take that on board a bit later.
Yeah, Ron Glatter. You're muted, Ron.
How can we get the new government to take this issue much more seriously than they are apparently going to do, with very minor incremental changes on the present basis. We need to do something about that, and I wonder if speakers have any thoughts about that, and I apologize for having to leave early to get a flu jab. I hope that this will be recorded because I think it's a terrific conference. Thank you very much.
It is being recorded, and there will be a summary document written at the end of it. Anybody else wishing to put forward any comments? Nobody? No other comments or questions? We have a couple of minutes. Rob, I wonder if you'd like to just respond to Michael's question, if you could, briefly. Everything's very brief here.
Everything's very brief. I think the comment was about how is centralization related to fragmentation. Was that right?
Michael?
It was more your interesting phrase of chaotic centralization, the overlap as things got larger. I thought that was an interesting view, but I didn't really get the detail.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so obviously post 2010, there's a range of different structures being created and a range of different organizations that are operating within the middle tier, from regional schools commissioners, Ofsted regional teams, local authorities providing services, multi-academy trusts, often without much thought about how these work out in the local area, and each of them producing to schools different conceptualizations of what school improvement, school services look like. So you get competing forms of kind of advice and support, and also competing claims to have authority and legitimacy over schools and within the school system. And that, I think, is one of the bases for fragmentation in a system, where you don't have a sort of coherence, and schools are being asked to respond to different agencies with different kind of vested interest in their own production within the system. So that's the kind of the viewpoint that we had from 4 localities across the UK. I hope that I could expand, but if I'm going to be brief, that is brief.
Well, thank you, Rob, very much. We will come back to you, I'm sure. And just to say that anyone who wants to put any comments or questions can do so in the chat. We will be looking at all of that at the end of this conference. So please put any comments or additional points in the chat. Anybody else? Did anybody else want to speak on the section of fragmentation or comment on the speakers? Is that Warwick? I can't hear. You're muted.
I don't know how to use the hand. Sorry, I just was interested. I had a question for Rob as well. I'm just kind of sometimes interested in the sort of interaction of the sort of quasi-market with the sort of top-down reforms you have with academy decision-making or decision-making by the government, the regional directors. Because I've certainly covered cases where there's particularly one in Cambridgeshire town at the moment where the community doesn't have any choice between 2 secondary schools, which are run by an academy trust, proving very controversial locally. And there's another one in London I can think of, again, 3 primary schools in one area, again run by a sort of a very distinctive academy trust, which certainly with some parents is unpopular, not many options. And I kind of wonder, it seems as if sometimes the DFE is kind of taking for granted that people have parental choice and you have these market mechanisms operating without actually considering the detail and actually whether they, it's almost like they're not even thinking about it very much. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how those two kind of tendencies interact. I mean, in some ways, I think it's not always the quasi-market it's not just market mechanisms that are operating anymore.
Rob, can I ask you, please, because we're going to move to the next section now, if you could possibly record that in your mind and or put something in the chat. That would be we'd be really grateful if you do that, because we would like to know your response. So I'm going to move to Carl Parsons now, who's going to introduce the section on professionalism.
Yeah, this is our second theme with 4 speakers, and the first is Warwick Mansell, journalist and founder of Education Uncovered, who will speak about how academy system has changed the staffing in schools. So over to you, Warwick.
Thanks very much. Right, straight from that question into my talk. Okay, so basically, I'm going to talk about two successive reports I've written for CASE. And obviously, one's been covered by John Galloway already. So they've both been published over the past 18 months. So that first one you've heard about looked at high spending on management, comparing the multi-academy trust sector to the situation in local authority maintained schools. And we did this through an extensive trawl of hundreds of academy trust accounts and also the accounts of England's largest local authorities. So I think John's presented some figures on that already. Perhaps the standout one for me was we found that the 50 largest academy trusts were spending 8 times more per pupil on salaries of £130,000 and over than were England's local authorities. So that's looking at, across the 50 trusts against the 10 largest local authorities in England. And then the second report I've done for CASE was actually just published yesterday. So it sought to interrogate extensive data sets from the DfE and from a freedom of information request I did to the DfE. And to answer this question, was there higher spending on management in maths accompanied by lower spending at classroom level? So we've done the first report and it kind of, you could see the higher spending on management and you think, well, that money must have to come from somewhere. So does it come from, are academy spending at less in classrooms? And the answer to that basically, as extensive data trawl, was yes. The academy sector seems to be spending more on management and less on classroom teaching and education support staff per pupil than does the LA maintained sector. So breaking that down, academies have slightly higher pupil-teacher ratios than do LA schools, with ratios higher still within the biggest academy chains. Classroom teachers are paid less on average than those in academies than those in LA schools. And a lot of these tendencies were particularly pronounced in sponsored academies. So these are schools usually taken over by an academy trust following an adverse Ofsted report. So teachers in sponsored academies were paid £2,000 less on average than those in LA schools. So you look at that and you think the solution to that might be seen to be national pay and conditions for all. But although academies don't follow national pay and conditions, there is no national pay and conditions arrangement for senior management within academy trusts. But for classroom staff, they do, most of them I think, tend to follow national pay and conditions arrangements. So it's not as if academies are spending less on paying people less for doing similar jobs to what they would be doing in the local authority, or staff with similar levels of experience being paid less for what they do. Rather, it's academies' lower spend on pay seems to come from the differences in the workforces in the two sectors. So those in academies and in sponsored academies in particular tend to be younger, with the proportion of teachers aged under 25 being almost 50% higher in sponsored academies than in LA schools, with the former having a workforce overall in sponsored academies which was 2 years younger than in LA schools. There's also a higher rate of teacher turnover, teachers leaving schools in academies and in the big academy chains in particular than in the LA sector. So some chains had 1 in 3 teachers leaving their schools in the recent year I analysed, that was 21-22, compared to an LA average rate of 15 to 16%. So, and a higher proportion of teachers working in sponsored academies do not have qualified teacher status. So it's 4% in primary sponsored academies compared to 1.8% in local authority schools, and 4.5% for secondary sponsored academies compared to 2.9% in the local authority secondary academies. That's teachers without qualified teacher status. Okay, so surveying all these statistics, it is possible to wonder why it is that one set of schools, academies and multi-academy trusts in particular, have been favoured over the other by governments, but that is the case. To summing up, academies and multi-academy trusts in particular have higher teacher turnover, lower teacher pay, higher pupil-teacher ratios, more spent on management, lower spend at classroom levels. So for LA schools, of course, that's the reverse of this. And yet, which structure has been favoured by governments? Okay, but asked to come up with solutions for this talk. First off, I think the new government should look seriously at all of this. I mean, some of these, statistics seem to be coming through quite consistently. There was I can also think of an Education Policy Institute report which came out earlier this year, which was also identifying higher teacher turnover within the larger academy chains, and this is in the context of a serious retention situation within schools, so you could call it a crisis. And so, it's surprising that governments are not looking at this government, and well, it's not surprising the previous government. This government should, I think, be looking at this very closely and investigating the impact in full of the multi-academy trust structure, which, of course, the Conservatives put in place as their favoured model for state-funded schools in England. And findings such as the teacher turnover statistics, which can coincide with a number of teachers leaving overalls, are said to be at its highest level since 2010, I think really give pause for thought. I think questions should be asked about the top-down nature of the multi-academy trust model, with highly paid management devising policies for the workforce to follow. Is this developing professionalism or creating a culture of uniformity and compliance, which is maybe proving off-putting to a relatively lower paid and junior workforce? Is that the case? I think we should certainly look into it in detail, and among the policymakers should be doing that. Beyond that, the academy scheme is hugely complex, and debating any possible changes here would take a lot more than I've got time for now. But central to any new approach, I think, would be about looking at the institutionalized remoteness of the policy. Rob Hyam touched on this a little bit in terms of the democratic deficit. It is institutionalized remoteness because the control in academy trust ultimately sits with only two parties, which is the trust board, which is unelected, and central government. This leaves local communities, including the workforce, on the outside. Addressing what I think its design fault, the central design fault from a public service perspective, will be the key to any truly meaningful reforms. That would entail a look at the fundamentals of this policy, which takes away the local community perspective in decision-making and arguably in its centralisation, and looking at how that can work against teacher professionalisation in favour of a more top-down model. But beyond that, the government just needs to look seriously at the detail of what is going on, because it's often not pretty. And that's it.
Thank you. Can I just ask, Warwick, was that scripted so that we can have that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It'd be very helpful.
Thank you, Warwick. Yeah. I think we go on to the next speaker, and then there'll be questions and comments on the end. So Louise, it's over to you. Louise Vincent, doctoral teaching fellow at the University of Oxford, on deprofessionalisation, how teacher roles have changed. Over to you, Louise.
Hi, thank you very much, Carl. And thank you, Warwick, because I think that your closing comments about the consequences of the current structuring of schools is a natural segue to what I want to talk about. As Carl said, my name is Louise, and I'm a doctoral student, also a teaching fellow at the University of Oxford. My research focuses on the history of teacher education in England, and an emerging theme in my work is teacher deprofessionalization, which I would like to address with you this morning. In general, deprofessionalization refers to the erosion of professional autonomy. It happens when professionals lose control over their work, are subject to performance metrics, and find their roles increasingly defined by standardized procedures. For teachers, this of course means less freedom to decide what and how to teach, and more reliance on mandated top-down curricula like Warwick was evoking, standardized testing and accountability measures like school inspections. So teachers in England have seen their professional autonomy eroded by a series of reforms. Central to this is the national curriculum, which mandates what teachers must teach and how they must assess students. This, of course, has been turbocharged in recent years since the mid-90s, with an inflated importance given to standardized testing like SATs and GCSEs, which pressures teachers to focus on exam preparation rather than more holistic educational goals. These developments, you can expect, leave little room for professional discretion, leading to a narrowing of what teaching means. The increasing influence of Ofsted inspections also plays a significant role. Ofsted's focus on data-driven results forces schools to prioritize measurable outcomes, such as stats scores and performance targets. As a result, teachers often find themselves performing teaching rather than focusing on the unique needs of their students. The deprofessionalization of teachers is a tragedy, not only for school staff, but for students as well. Without professional autonomy, teachers cannot cater to their students' needs. Creativity and spontaneity, everything that makes school fun in the first place, is stifled in the classroom. And as a result, students receive a narrower, less engaging education focused on passing exams rather than on their holistic development. Additionally, as has been so poignantly preempted by the previous speakers, the rise of multi-academy trusts since 2010 has led to a managerial approach in education where state schools are increasingly organized like for-profit businesses. In these systems, teachers are subject to performance management regimes that resemble corporate oversight rather than educational leadership. This managerialism contributes to teacher alienation and burnout as their work becomes more about meeting organizational targets rather than nurturing students' growth. So, what policies could counter this deprofessionalization? I know I'm preaching to a very receptive choir this morning, and there's a limit to what any of us here can do. I suspect at the heart of this issue of teacher deprofessionalization lies a lack of political will rather than a lack of knowledge about what's going on. Be that as it may, I offer several policy changes that could be implemented to restore professional autonomy. May it serve as a guide to action in our own respective contexts. 1. Teachers need to be represented in curriculum design. Teachers need a stronger voice in shaping the national curriculum and educational policies going forward. Ensuring that experienced educators have a say in what and how they teach would re-empower them, making teaching less about rigid adherence to rules and more about professional expertise. This is true at the school level as well. Every teacher needs to be involved with lesson planning so that they are critically invested in what and why they teach. Centrally mandated PowerPoints are no replacement for teacher professional experience. 2, we must reduce the focus on standardized testing. High-stakes exams like SATs and GCSEs have placed undue pressure on teachers and students alike. Shifting towards formative assessments which allow teachers to adapt their teaching methods to students' needs could help reinstate the professional judgments teachers once held. 3, the role of Ofsted needs reform. Rather than focusing solely on data and metrics, inspection should look at more holistic indicators of student and staff well-being and school culture. 4, lastly, the rise of managerialism in schools needs to be checked. School leaders should focus more on genuinely supporting teachers' professional developments rather than simply enforcing performance targets. Schools should also reduce administrative burdens on teachers, allowing them to focus on what they do best, teaching. In conclusion, the deprofessionalization of teachers in England is a growing issue that threatens the quality of education and the well-being of our teachers. However, with the right approach, we can reverse these trends and restore teaching as a respected and rewarding profession. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Full of hope in that last sentence. We move to Chris Fabi of Unison, who will be speaking about the roles of support staff, who are also vital to the experience of children in their schools and classrooms. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Carl. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So, as you rightly say, school support staff do a wide variety of vital roles in schools: catering, cleaning, admin, pupil support, welfare support, teaching assistants. Now, one thing all these varied roles have in common is that the scale of their duties and their workload has increased significantly since the last Labour government. And really, there have been three key drivers of that expansion of the scale of their duties and their workload. And they are not exclusive, but the key drivers: the COVID pandemic and how roles changed during the COVID pandemic, the cost of living crisis. In particular, we've seen an expansion of the pastoral and welfare support need for supporting pupils and parents. And then thirdly, the one I want to major on is the impact of the underfunding of education for 14 years by the previous government. So one example of this is what's happened to the demarcation between teaching assistant roles and teaching roles. Now, the root of this erosion of a demarcation is very simple. We've had a recruitment and retention crisis among the school workforce. The main driver of that has been that the previous government made significant real-term cuts to the pay of the school workforce. And we've had a recruitment and retention crisis, and schools confronting that recruitment and retention crisis amongst teachers, because of their lack of adequate funding, have increasingly turned to teaching assistants to plug the gaps, either for teacher absences or where they've not been able to recruit and retain. Rob Webster, who's the internationally recognised researcher on the role of teaching assistants in schools, conducted a research for Unison this year, 6,000 teaching assistants. And what that found was that now regularly a significant proportion of teaching assistants are routinely, so weekly effectively, covering for teacher absences where a school's not been able to recruit and retain teacher. 51% of TAs in secondary say they're regularly covering classes, a quarter in primary. In secondary schools, we've even got some TAs who are teaching subjects at GCSE level. Now, to be clear, there has always been, for some higher graded TAs, an element of their job description where in only very limited circumstances, or certainly with set criteria, they could provide cover for a teacher. But what we're seeing here has gone way beyond that now, where actually two things are happening. One, a predominantly low paid workforce, which teaching assistants are, some can earn as low as £14,000 a year, are being exploited. It's the underfunding that's driven that exploitation. But two, and this is where we talk about the impact on pupils, by using TAs as cover, it's taken them away from their primary role, which is about providing one-to-one support for children with additional learning needs, children with special education needs, or children who are struggling. That one-to-one work with the pupil, a small group work. And as a result, a majority of the respondents to our survey are saying that work's suffering. They're no longer able to provide that targeted work because they're providing emergency cover. And that's really important because the research shows from the Education Endowment Foundation that targeted deployment of teaching assistants, delivering one-to-one intervention, small group work, can add 5 additional months of pupil progress over the course of a year. So to be clear, pupils are missing out on that because TAs are being used as emergency cover due to the recruitment and retention crisis. So finally, looking to the future, what needs to happen? I know it's an obvious point, but we need to address funding. The government's going to have to invest properly in education to make up for the 14 years of underfunding we had from the previous government. That's the only way we're going to resolve the recruitment retention crisis, alongside real terms pay increases to make up for that erosion of pay. So TAs can get back to the most valuable part of the work, that targeted one-to-one interventions. And we need a national dialogue with government where to restart to have a restatement of a demarcation between teaching and support staff roles. That's going to need probably regulation, certainly an update of the national agreement around when TAs can cover for support staff roles. And then finally, we need to formally recognise the professional roles that support staff of all occupations, catering, cleaning, teaching assistants, do in their own right. We need nationally updated job descriptions. We need proper pay that reflects the work they do. They're some of the lowest paid workers in the country. We need investment in training and development, and we need a proper career structure so support staff can develop and go up through the grades and jobs in schools. Finish on a hopeful note. The new government has committed to reintroducing a national school support staff negotiating body, which will look at pay, terms and conditions and training for support staff. That's really important and really welcome. But alongside that, we also need in the budget real terms increase in school funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. So if we move to number 4, it's Philip Foyle, representing the NEU, on a related area, really, recruitment, retention and shortfall in ITE. So over to you, Phil.
Hello, everyone. You can hear me okay?
Yes, great.
Brilliant. Right. Well, yeah, so much of what I've heard has been speaking to the things I'm going to talk about, and so much of what I'm talking about is going to be related to so many other things to do with professionalism and recruitment and retention, to do with curriculum. I'll try and keep it coherent. I think that what I need to start by saying is that ITT and induction for ECTs is going reasonably well for many early career teachers and trainee teachers. So, for example, more are happy than unhappy with their training. More are talking about staying on in teaching than want to leave. But those figures, where they are positive, there's always a kind of the dragging of a fairly long tail of neutral feelings and of quite settled unhappiness about the training. So this is a problem we're seeing sort of across the sector with ECTs and with student trainee teachers. We've got recruitment and retention figures that are remaining really low, and there seems these features, these characteristics of the things that have been described to us and the things we're learning about suggest a system that is under stress, that's overloaded. Among student teachers, ECTs, who are taking on unprecedented levels of challenge in the classroom. So we have a real problem with this. I think that our position, my position as a teacher of 30 years standing, but the union position is that this situation can't improve until there is a recasting, a fundamental recasting of what education is all about, what teachers do, and particularly how much ownership they have over the language that describes what they do. And I don't mean the language of teacher standards. That is not much to do with really what teachers are engaging with in the classroom, which is relational. But I think there are some sort of proposals that about ITE and induction that I think I and the NEU can stand behind when it comes to thinking about and talking about what we'd like to see in terms of recruitment and retention. So, and these are based on the evidence provided by ECT, student teachers in surveys and studies we've either commissioned or carried out ourselves. So we support the principle of an induction program. It's not that we're against it, but we want to see an induction that's formed by a shared understanding, built on sector-wide consultation about what new teachers will need. I think primarily we need better frameworks. We need something that speaks to a more ambitious vision of what teachers do, more generous ways of thinking about pedagogy and the roles and capabilities and the professionalism, to hark back to what Louise was saying earlier, of teachers. There is no evidence of the ECF rollout having had positive impact on recruitment and retention. what is true is that ECTs are continuing to leave at higher rates than more experienced teachers are. And when we look at the framework that teachers have to deal with, it is, I don't want to reiterate what so many people here will already think and know, but this idea, this ingrained model now of top-down instructional kind of monologic models of you know, this instructional transmitter receptor version is becoming ingrained. And I think that teachers always need to be engaged in questions about identity, about what teachers are, what they do. They're encouraged to question approaches, and that's how I learned to teach, and that's what happened when I became a teacher a long time ago. And it doesn't seem to be happening anymore. So I'm sure it is, of course. There are plenty of places where there's fantastic training, but I'm thinking about the way in which teachers have to be inducted into a fairly narrow pedagogy. I think it needs to be said that there are no unchallengeable orthodoxies about teaching. I think that if we look back to the national strategies of 20 odd years ago, or the Ofsted's 3-part lesson and the plenary, these things that were set in stone and that would last forever, where are they now? There is no such thing as a kind of settled one way of doing things, and I think that we need to be reminded about that when thinking about the ECF and the frameworks. And I think that teachers need to see themselves and their experiences in their training, just as a good curriculum will, particularly for all young people, but particularly for disadvantaged young people, they need to see themselves, their ideas, their beliefs, their opinions, their values reflected in what they're learning about. And I think that that's also true of the training frameworks for training teachers and for ECTs. They need to see their experiences represented in a system, in a model that can't often reflect the context in which they're actually operating. I think there are concerns about the upcoming framework, the ITT-CF. I know there are a couple of universities that are concerned about how they're going to be measured or inspected in terms of what they're covering and what the ECF is covering, and those concerns are fairly understandable, given that the framework kind of takes 3 years to come to fruition, if you like, and yet IT providers are being assessed on the first year of that. The other thing about moving on from the ECF is that CPD is something that comes up time and time again in our surveys. It needs to be so much better, particularly when it comes to SEND provision. I think our members tell us that where SEND is going really well for them in their training, it is because of the role of the SENCO and the role of experienced SEND teachers in schools.
Sorry, could you wind up, please?
Oh, sorry, not so much to do with what they're getting from the framework training. I'll finish by just talking about some foundational principles of ITE, which we'd like to consider. Firstly, the idea of teachers as intellectuals who take an inquiring stance to their work and make meaningful contributions to the professional knowledge base. That's from USET 2020. It can't be better as a basis for autonomy, professionalism, and teacher agency. The idea that learning takes place in an untidy reality, and that new teachers need, above all, to observe, to try, to reflect, to fail better, and that narrow directives such as learn that can never prompt the kind of reflexive awareness that an invitation to understand how would. I'll wind up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was covering a lot of ground, Chris. Thank you. Philip, sorry. I think that it's for me just to say a few words about the 4 sections, the 4 contributions we've had, where there's a lot wrong. The social segregation that Warwick had talked about, and the turnover, the lack of respect for teachers, and so on. And I think I'm not going to go through all of that, but there is also expressed in from all four speakers a semblance of hope. There is the if we were to look at. And I'm just reminded, particularly of Philip's last contribution. I was a teacher educator for nearly 30 years and ran a primary PGC course and so on. And the sort of directive, non-consultative way in which teachers are treated now is different from the way it was. But I don't want to say, just as bring back local authorities, bring it back to the way it was 15 years ago. But there is something awful and limiting that has happened in the 14 years, and certainly a demotion of the status of teachers, of their autonomy, the relational nature of their job, but they make that in relation to the teacher, the pupils that they teach. And it comes also round to Ron Latter's point about how do we make the people who are making the decisions listen to what we're saying and react to it. And I think it's a vital area that they do that in relation to this body of people who do the job in schools, the professionals. And professionalisation needs to be racked up somewhat, and the respect that goes with doing that job, and we will get the job done better. So over to inclusion now, I think. Who's leading on that?
It's me. So yeah, next area is inclusion. I think all speakers so far have touched on this area, and it always seems to be the one that's biggest hit when resources are reduced. So I'm very much looking forward to what the speakers have to say. So the first speaker today is Dave Thompson from the FFT Data Labs, and his talk is entitled "Who is in our schools? Admissions exclusions and unofficial managed moves determine access to schools." So over to you, Dave.
You're muted, Dave.
Thanks very much. I'm going to share a few slides. Hopefully you'll be able to see them. Great. Right, are they moving? Good. Right, so I'm Dave Thompson. I'm a statistician, and I run FFT Education Data Lab. We study the education system in England using data, quantitative data, usually collected by the government. And one of my interests is how, or the extent to which pupils leave schools, and who is leaving, and when and why. Right, so we've been following several cohorts of young people from when they join a mainstream school in year 7 all the way through to the end of year 11. And for this piece of analysis, we only look at schools that cover the full 7 to 11 age range. So we ignore those where we expect a pupil to leave a school before the end of year 11. For example, if they move from a middle school to a high school. And roughly what we see, and it's quite consistent over the last few years, is around 14% of pupils who start a school in year 7 will have left by the end of year 11. And we could split those into two. So we've got half of them, roughly, they'll move on to a different mainstream school. And the other half will leave the mainstream sector entirely. And we'll look at the destinations that they go to in a second.
Are these supposed to be on the screen, Dave?
They are, yes.
Have you not got them? I'm sharing it.
Oh, you're sharing it?
Yeah.
I'm not seeing them.
I can see the slides, if that's helpful.
Oh, why can't I?
Yeah, I can see.
Are you sharing your screen, Dave?
I'm sharing my screen.
I can see them. Yeah, I can see them.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen too.
Ah.
And I think mine might have overtaken. If I stop my share,
Yeah.
now I have you, Dave, but I don't have the slides.
That's correct. That's the same for me.
Okay, so if I share mine, Dave, is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Right.
Right.
Success?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. So 14% of pupils is around 80,000 pupils in a year group. Obviously, it depends on the size of the year group. They vary in size from year to year, and you can think of those as a continuum. So at one end, you've got those moves that are entirely initiated by the school, so permanent exclusions, probably around 7,000 to 8,000 in a cohort. And then at the other end, you've got those situations where families just relocate, and the move is entirely initiated by the family. And we think there are about 13,000 of those in the most recent cohort, and the rest we don't really know why they're leaving. Now let's have a look at those who leave the mainstream sector completely. Now, sorry, you've gone too far.
Okay.
There we go. Perfect. Yep. We've got around 19,000. We don't know what their destination is. Some will have emigrated. Some will have moved into elective home education. The rest we can see. So we see some pupils moving out into special schools, into AP schools, and a few into the independent sector, including some where the local authority is paying for them to be educated in the independent sector in alternative provision. Now let's have a look at some of those who are leaving. That's the next slide, please, John. Okay, you might not be able to see this terribly well. Apologise. It's on the website, which I've given you a link to. And there's no surprises here about who's tending to move more. So it's disadvantaged pupils, it's those with EHC plans, or who have needed SEN support at some point in their school career, and it's those who have lower levels of prior attainment at Key Stage 2. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of some data on pupil mobility, pupil moves through the system. Next week, we'll be publishing 2 reports that we've written for CASE, which looks at how mobility varies between local authority schools and academy schools, and between different academy trusts. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you very much for that, Dave. Again, very interesting. Great use of the data. That can really inform debate. Okay, so we're moving on now to our next speaker, who is Chris Robertson, the visiting professor at University of Derby, and his talk is entitled SEND, the Patchy and Unequal Provision. So over to you, and thanks very much for joining us, Christopher.
Good morning, Tom and colleagues. I think, John, you're going to put some slides up?
Yep. Just coming.
Okay, I will pause till they arrive. And we can move swiftly on from the title and make some very brief comments on the context of special educational needs and inclusive education in the English context. Firstly, it's a truism to say that negative experiences are the norm for children, young people and families if they happen to have a special education needs and disability label. At the same time, I do think it important to note that there is good quality educational provision available in different parts of the country across sectors and phases. However, again, a truism, that's being provided in the face of or in spite of policy rather than because of it. And that actually, we've got to be honest and say that many of the systemic problems in the system in England can be identified as far back as 1999 and can not only be associated with where we are today or in the most recent decade. Next, please. There is...
Right. Yeah.
Thanks, John. There's an obvious blame game, and I won't run through this list in detail. You'll all be familiar with the people that get blamed for so-called broken SEND system in England. However, I was shocked to see in the recently published ISOS Partnership Local Government Authority report on this that they took a very neutral stance, didn't acknowledge that blame could actually be attributed to three key players, I think, for systemic failure. The first is central government. The second, as I will argue, is actually the National Inspectorate. And the third, it has to be said, is local authority leadership in many respects. We go back to 2010 very briefly. From the points noted here, it was very evident in 2010 when a coalition government came into power that SEN policy was going to be marginal to majority focused policy. So it was put very much in a wing. And the 2010 Ofsted report should not be forgotten. It was really influential. It influenced the government at the time. Next slide, please. And put forward a rather bizarre argument about SEN being too broadly used as a categorization. And there's some truth in that. What it actually led to in reality was local authorities, schools, and government determining that we could write off 500,000 children and young people with special educational needs almost at a stroke. And that fed into policy that followed. Next slide, please. So in effect, local areas deregistered significant numbers of children. Some notion that a so-called universal teaching would resolve all problems immediately for a significant number of children and young people became the leitmotif for policy. And this fed directly into policy and legislation. Next slide, please. And when we had a framework for improvement introduced, and you can see it in summary form here through legislation, guidance, inspection regimes, and then more recently, repair jobs in terms of the special education needs review and the new improvement plan, what we actually have put in place has not led in any way, shape, or form to an improved system. So actually policy that the last government introduced was naive in terms of the way that it significantly ignored completely things like curriculum design and expectations of children and young people. Failure was built into current SEN policy by exclusion. So too many children and young people were not thought of because the government's sole focus was on a small group of children and young people can have their needs better met through education, healthcare, planning, etc. And policy completely abjectly failed to anticipate the role that local authorities will be able to play in the future with regard to their statutory duties. We now are in a position, bridging last government to where we are with this government, and by the way, we have been faced with pretty much silence from the minister responsible for special education needs and disability since the new government came into power. There's a lot going on underneath the radar, as it were, but the Department for Education in particular has been characterized by poor communication, inadequate coherence of its initiatives, bizarre rapid evaluation claims, poor scrutiny of what it's doing, and a complete lack of political leadership. So whether that's the last government or where we are now, ministerial leadership has either been transient or focused on missing in action. It's also the case, and it's important to note, that the Department for Education has become deeply mistrusted by the Treasury because of the way it has handled SEND financing over a 15, 20-year period. Next slide.
Are we able to wind up, please, Christopher?
Yes, last slide. So we need to rebuild trust, make sure there's appropriate political leadership, have genuine stakeholder engagement in the system that isn't about usual suspects, have proper, more independent support and challenge available, and we must grapple with the important conceptual challenges in the system and re-examine key roles in the system. For example, educational psychologists, therapists, and revisit what the basics are to make a system work better very, very soon and not 10 years down the line. Last slide. The SEND Policy Research Group that I'm a member of has put together its own agenda for trying to address some of these challenges, and you can look that up using the reference I've given you. Thanks.
Thanks, Christopher.
Thank you very much, Chris. Again, really lots in there, lots to think about. Okay, we're moving on then. Our next speaker is Dr. Sin Shao, and the title of her talk is Mental Health and Wellbeing, Action to Support Children, and this came from the Cosmo project out of University College London. So welcome, Sin.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Xin from the UCL. I'm glad to be here to share with you some of the policy implications based on our mental health and well-being findings using the evidence from data analysis from the COVID social mobility and opportunities study, COSMO. Just a quick background, COSMO is a new youth cohort study that provides evidence on socioeconomic inequalities in life chances for a generation of young people impacted by the pandemic and cost of living crisis. Next slide, please. So the policy implications. Our funding shows a significant proportion of young people are experiencing poor well-being and mental health, with 44% reporting high psychological distress, which is a notable increase compared to the previous cohorts over the past 15 years. This once again highlights the need for sustainable and well-funded support for young people experiencing mental health issues, including preventative and early intervention services to prevent future cohorts from experiencing such issues. Support should recognize and deal with major life events that a young person may experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, such as having non-COVID or having had to shield. Our research also finds that those in state comprehensive schools were far less likely to be satisfied with the mental health support offered by their school during the pandemic compared to those at grammar and independent schools. This inconsistency should be tackled by ring-fenced funding for mental health support in all schools that adequately recognizes the scale of support required by students following the pandemic. So funding should go towards implementation of a whole school approach to well-being, having access to an independent counselor for students, and introducing mental health support teams into every school. So mental health and well-being support should also be added to catch-up activities in schools and colleges for all students, with specific interventions for those with existing mental health issues. A proportion of funding for education-related catch-up should also be added to funding allocations and ring-fenced for mental health support. Our findings indicate poor mental health and well-being for those identified outside the gender binary. So more targeted support for non-binary and trans students is required to be delivered by professionals who have been trained to understand the needs of these young people. So furthermore, measures to reduce the risks faced by these groups, not next slide, still the previous one. Thank you. Measures to reduce the risks faced by these groups should be included in both new national self-harm and suicide prevention plans, as well as local plans, with a national framework setting out how to do so. Next slide, please. Nearly a quarter of participants in our COSMO cohort say that they have been bullied at school. So local and national strategies, therefore, should continue to be needed to tackle bullying at school, particularly dealing with cyberbullying on social media, all schools should implement a well-evidenced anti-bullying program. Such strategies and programs should recognize the heightened experiences of bullying and harassment identified for marginalized groups such as non-binary plus individuals and adapt plans accordingly. There's also association between a young person's mental health and the mental health of their parents. This suggests a need for well-being of children to be considered while mental health risks are identified in their parents. Last but not least, given the inequalities in accessing mental health support, improvements to mental health services in disadvantaged areas and disadvantaged schools is particularly important. Next slide, please, the last slide. So I'm aware of the time, and for more detailed research findings, including other areas for the inclusion of education, you're very welcome to go to our Cosmo website. Thank you.
Very much, then. Again, very interesting, and I've read that report, and I would thoroughly recommend it. It's very interesting work and really pertinent. Okay, so we're moving on to our last speaker in this particular area of inclusion. It's Kate Anstey from the Child Poverty Group, and her talk is entitled "Poverty and Deprivation: The Role of Schools and Need for Government Action." So over to you, Kate. Thanks very much for joining us.
Kate's is a video. She recorded it earlier in the week.
Apologies to Kate's video.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Anstey, and I'm from the Child Poverty Action Group, and I'm going to be talking for 5 minutes today about the role of schools in tackling child poverty and also the need for government action. So, in terms of the numbers, we're currently talking about 4.3 million children who live below the poverty line. That's 30%. And for this context, that is around 9 children in a classroom of 30. And that is currently a record high. And we predict that that will continue to go up if there's no government action. In terms of schooling, you can see from this graph that poverty is a very, very strong predictor of how well a child will do at school. We often look just between the two groups of kind of those that are eligible for free school meals and those that aren't. But this graph shows that actually, as you kind of work up the income scale, there's this very close relationship between household income and how well children will achieve at GCSE level. Not only is poverty having obviously a significant impact on children in terms of their health, their learning, and their well-being, but it's also having an impact on schools and the way that they function. So we ran a survey last year with 1,000 school staff across England. Across the board, they're saying we're seeing the levels of poverty in our school kind of increase. They're saying the depth of poverty is getting much worse. They're seeing it affecting many more families who were previously doing okay. And what's more, school staff are saying that actually the effects of poverty and sort of mitigating the effects of poverty and taking up an increasing amount of their time and their colleagues' time. So things like sourcing food or uniform, or helping families with grants or looking for washing machines, that is all taking up staff time and kind of moving their attention away from the core parts of their roles. So it is really playing out very strongly in schools. At CPAG, we look at school costs as a particular area, and we do a lot of research around this. So we're talking about some of those big things that families find very challenging, uniform, food, but also some of those more hidden costs in terms of a sort of trip or a trip to the fair or a book fair, those kind of hidden costs. We did a piece of research last year with Loughborough University to understand exactly how much money we're talking about, how much does school really cost families, and we found at a minimum parents are paying £18 a week for a primary school child, and at a minimum nearly £40 a week for secondary. And as you can see, those numbers add up significantly over the course of a year. And of course, if you have more than one child, it's a lot more than that. So in a system that is supposed to be free, there are certainly many costs that come with going to school. Very quickly, we know that for schools, it's important for them to think about all families, not just those that are registered for free school meals. 1 in 3 children in poverty don't qualify for a free school meal, and often poverty is very hidden, and it's dynamic as well. So it's not always the same group over time. In terms of what schools can do, there's lots schools can do. Review your school costs, see how much the school day is costing families. See where you can reduce your school costs, and make kind of tweaks and changes to what you do. Look at the issue of stigma and inclusion. Are there practices and processes that make children more distinguishable because of their hardship? And also think about the way that you communicate support to families, making sure they have enough notice throughout the year and they know what's coming. In terms of our asks on government, we talk about it in 3 ways. Firstly, abolishing poverty producing policies like the 2-child limit, then expand measures that prevent poverty, such as child benefit and making free school meals universal, and then finally imagining a society where no children live in poverty, and that's through a comprehensive child poverty strategy. And we are glad to hear that one has been committed to this spring. But of course, the devil will be in the detail in terms of what that includes. We do have lots of resources on our website for you to check out, particularly if you're working in schools. And please do get in touch if you'd like to hear any more. Thank you.
Okay, great. I would say thank you to Kate, but obviously she's not with us again. Another really interesting presentation. So to try and bring all those together, it would appear again that the experience of students, particularly the more disadvantaged students, is different to those who are not disadvantaged, and often it's much more impoverished. That's not the case across the nation. There are pockets of good practice, as we've heard, but as a general, the generalisation, attendance, SEND, poverty, mental health, all impact on the school experience, and all of those things are going to need addressing if we're really looking to address the areas around inclusion, which are, one of the thorniest and knottiest issues in school, absolutely for sure. The need for national strategy, I think, was quite clear among all our speakers, but also the need for local strategies. And this probably links to, I would suggest, the fragmentation of our current system and how we implement those changes that are necessary to address attendance, SEND, poverty, mental health, and all the other issues around inclusion and making students have a really positive educational experience. All of our students, not just those who can afford it or those who are less disadvantaged. Again, thank you very much to all our speakers. Really interesting stuff. I'm now going to pass over to the next topic, which I believe is the curriculum.
Hi, everyone. I will be introducing the speakers for this 4th and final theme this morning, curriculum. As Tom said, we have 3 speakers coming up, and we're going to start with James Lane, who is a head teacher of St. Francis de Sales School. James' presentation is called The Bold and Balanced Curriculum, Need for a New Vision. Over to you, James.
You might
Thank you very much. John, I believe you're going to share my slides for me.
Yep.
Lovely. Okay. John, I'll give you a shout just to move on to the next one. But thank you very much, everybody. My name's Dr. James Lane, and my doctorate was in system leadership. I have a particular interest in why schools really struggle to work well in collaboration, and if there's ways that school leaders can work well in partnerships. I'm not talking about that today. I want to focus on the curriculum, and if we all want a rich, varied, innovative, diverse, and inclusive curriculum that focus on wider outcomes for young people, then why don't we have it if it's something we all want? Oddly enough, I'm going to start with bird poo. May seem strange, but a few years ago, in Washington, D.C., they were looking for solutions to the amount of bird poo on the Lincoln Memorial. Now, you may want to rush to a solution just by washing it off, but someone thought, actually, let's dig a little bit deeper. It was identified that the birds were drawn to the memorial to eat the spiders that gathered around the columns, and the spiders were there to catch the small insects that swarmed there at night. And the insects were there because of the lighting that was done during the evening. So the solution to the excessive bird poo problem was to change the rules of how the lighting was done on the Lincoln Memorial. Now, I use this as an example of why we can't talk about improvements in school curriculum without digging a little bit deeper into the constrictions of the system. Now, already today, most of the speakers have spoken about the education system. And we expect the system to do a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to system improvement. We talk about system leadership, system thinking, system improvement, the self-improving school system, system change, system solutions. But actually, you can see the definition there on the screen. The system is actually probably the biggest problem we have, and we're not manipulating the system to our advantage at all. What ends up happening is the system shapes the leaders, and the individuals act in ways that perhaps they shouldn't. If you just click forward, please, John. In reality, the system is just a web of interconnectedness, the DFE, Ofsted schools, other institutions and educational settings. But the problem is the system has no moral purpose. The system isn't ethical. We tend to think about the system as an enabler of improvements, but enables sets of outcomes, irrespective of the good intentions of the individuals who operate within the system. In reality, it's more likely to constrict behaviors and shape leaders over time into a way that they behave at odds with their own values, beliefs, and ethics. Most worryingly, the system produces sets of outcomes that we as individuals really do not want. A narrow curriculum, schools as exam factories, poor outcomes for vulnerable learners are just a few examples of the outcomes promoted by the systems. Now, academies aren't responsible for all of those things, but certainly some of those elements have been amplified by the academization in the last decade and a half. All of these outcomes, the narrow curriculum and exam factories and vulnerable learners struggling, are what we would identify as undesirable outcomes. Now, those scandals you just saw on the screen are scandals in themselves, and you'll be well aware of them. Now, I'm not saying that the individuals responsible for those shouldn't be held personally accountable, but within all of those scandals, there is a problem of leadership, and these people have acted in ways they shouldn't. If we go to the next, do go forward now, John, thank you. The education system, no, sorry, back to the blue one.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. We have our own scandals in education. If you look at this, our accountability processes create a scandal around the way that we deal with our most vulnerable learners. And the last section on SEN learners was really interesting because it really reinforces this point. There appears to be a lack of moral accountability. It just seems so bizarre, doesn't it? Now, this research in 2018 is just as relevant now as it was then. But what we know as individuals and what we do does not really change education system. All systems thinking research is very clear on this. In a majority of cases, individuals, even larger organizations, do not impact on the system at all. System improvement cannot be done by school leaders themselves. Even the best MATs or unions or groups like ours, CASE, their unit of influence is too small. Now, it may upsetting to hear, but the work we all do as individuals and the benefits we get in a few isolated cases do not really bring about system-wide change. We can't fight the system from within, but we must change the rules. As they change the lighting on the Lincoln Memorial, we need to look at how the rules change. John, just go forward to the next one. So to try and bring about just sort of an idea of what we can be doing to try and change those rules, we can't fight the system. The impact we have at the system at this level is too low. We need to look at how we change the rules. John, just go forward to the next one. We spoke about Ofsted before, and people have spoken about John, just go forward to the next slide. Thanks. Ofsted's just gone through the big listen. As a consultation around changes to Ofsted, it is a really big system player. It sets the rules level. We need to be making sure that the system is impacted by the big system players. Direct instruction, retrieval practice, and adapting teaching are all examples of rapid, significant system change brought about by a player like Ofsted. The next thing we need to look at is the narrow and technical conceptualization of school leadership. The MPQs are limited. Most leaders do an MPQ, but actually they don't cover everything they need to. That report there by Big Education is really useful. I recommend that you read it. John, the last slide, please.
All right. Yep.
That's okay. Louise spoke earlier. I was really interested to hear Louise talk about curriculum design, and others people have spoken about it as well. We need to gather our forces around this. Now, there are organizations really doing good work around an innovative, diverse curriculum which incorporates wider outcomes. I would say we need to, and I'm just sorry, a bit of a cross-organization recommendation there, but Big Education is doing some really good work around this. And if we gather together to become less compliant as as a group of educationalists, to put pressure in places that can change the rules, then we can get a curriculum that our young people deserve. And that's the end from me.
Thank you very much, James, Dr. Lane. Yeah, I really appreciate the call out, and I agree with you there that as educationalists of all levels, we need to resist the top-down curriculum mandates. Now, everyone, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, still in this curriculum theme. Her name is Laura Oxley. She is affiliated to the University of York, and her talk, which I'm actually really looking forward to, is entitled Discipline and Behavior Towards a Humane Consensus. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Louise. So I just have one slide, John, if you could pop that up for me. Mainly just give everyone something to look at besides looking at me during my talk. But hopefully you'll see the relevance of each of my visuals as I go through. So, discipline and behaviour. It's a tale that's as old as time, with every generation of teachers likely to say that behaviour in schools at that particular point in time is now the worst it's ever been. But what's clear is that the rise in challenging behaviour in schools now, in 2024, has reached something of a crisis point. We've heard today about the recruitment and retention crisis in the teaching profession, and we know that pupil behaviour is a key driver behind teachers deciding to leave the profession. Now, following the disruption to school caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, research has shown that teachers have noticed a marked increase in challenging behaviours in the classroom. And recent publications have also highlighted that school exclusions have risen during this same time period. And these are continuing to rise, with many of our most vulnerable children being disproportionately affected by this. So thank you very much for inviting me here to speak to you today. As introduced, my name is Laura Oxley. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of York, with my research interests being in behaviour management and wellbeing in schools. Now, prior to embarking on my PhD, I worked for a number of years in schools and with local authority teams, specifically working with children and young people who were either at risk of being excluded from their schools or had already been excluded from their mainstream school placements. Now, as well as working with the students themselves, I also worked with their families, with the other professionals involved with them, and of course with the staff at their schools. And one of the situations that I saw playing out again and again was that of the student behaving in a way that was not acceptable to the school, and the school responding by imposing a sanction. And then the very next day, or sometimes even the very next lesson, the student would go back into the classroom and they would repeat that exact same type of challenging behaviour. And the school would respond by, well, you guessed it, by imposing the exact same sanction. Except that then gradually these sanctions would start to escalate over time as the student became caught on this pathway towards being excluded from school. But actually, both the students and the school were caught in this entrenched cycle of repetitive challenging behaviour, followed by sanctions, followed by more challenging behaviour, followed by more sanctions, and so it continued and so forth. So for my PhD, I focused on exploring the views of senior leaders in schools on different approaches to behaviour management, approaches that were specifically more collaborative and compassionate than the default system of using rewards and sanctions to manage behaviour. Examples include restorative approaches and also collaborative and proactive solutions. But actually, it could be any approach that's based on the principles of building and maintaining positive relationships between students and staff, and on the principle of working with the students rather than imposing sanctions on them. And one of the key findings from my study was that school leaders were continuing to use this dominant approach of rewards and sanctions, not because they necessarily thought that it was the best approach or the most effective approach to managing behaviour, but because they were lacking access to sufficient funds and resources that would enable them to implement any alternative approaches in any sort of meaningful way. Another barrier that was highlighted was that school leaders were concerned about what others would think if they did try something different. They were worried about what parents would think, what their staff would think, what other school leaders would think. They didn't want their schools to be seen as a soft touch, as a school that didn't value discipline and want to enforce positive behaviour. When actually all of the school leaders that were involved in that study, they wanted to be able to support both their staff and their students in managing behaviour effectively and compassionately. But many felt that there were these barriers there that in the current system that were preventing them from being able to do so. Now, one of these barriers is something that can be worked on. We can raise awareness about the principles of these different approaches among the school community and talk to parents and staff and school leaders about how these approaches can be more effective and compassionate and move away from this idea that we need to have a punitive approach in response to challenging behaviour. The other barrier, the access to resources and funding, requires systemic change. It's not something that one school can do alone. Having said that, there are some schools who are trying to use alternative approaches that are trying to prioritise this more compassionate approach to persistently challenging behaviour. And we can learn from and build on their good practice, but this increased access to appropriate funding and resources for behaviour management is needed for all schools. So just to wrap up, there's a saying that goes that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And this is something that's currently happening in our schools in regard to behaviour, and this needs to change. We need to break this cycle. While school leaders might have the will and the motivation to make changes, they need the support and the access to sufficient resources and funding to be able to make that change a reality and to begin to move towards a more compassionate and humane way of managing the most challenging and vulnerable students in our education system. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your talk, Laura. We really appreciate it. Finally, we move to our last and final guest speaker before conclusion and open discussion. Still in the theme of curriculum, may I introduce Michael Freeston, who is today representing the Early Years Alliance. Michael will be giving a talk entitled Prioritizing Early Years. As in years, sorry.
Yes, early years. Yes, thank you, Louise. And thanks to Case for inviting me to speak on early education, which is often not always seen as part of the state education system. So I'm delighted that Melian and others invited me to speak today. John, are you able to do my slides, please, or am I doing them?
No, I am. There we are.
Thank you. I freaked myself out there looking at myself when I was expecting the slides. Thank you. I just wanted to look, if you move it straight on to the next one, I won't take long with many slides. When I was turning my mind to the title of Rebooting Education, where would I reboot to in regards to early education? I went to the period to about 1998 to 2008, where for once we genuinely had a government, I believe, that was putting early education as its fundamental priority, rather than the balance shifting within childcare. But since 2008, things have become more muddled. And so just what I thought I would give an indication of is what we have learned in the period since 2008. And interestingly, while government is always talking about evidence-based policy, actually this was policy that then got justified by the evidence that came afterwards. If you recall, during the period of 1998 to 2008, we had the Sure Start initiative. We had neighbourhood nursery initiatives to address the situation we have increasingly of childcare deserts, where the market is failing and children, particularly in disadvantaged areas, have less access to quality high education. And things have moved since then. But I think the evidence that has been developed since that period of time demonstrates that actually those were the right policies. SEED, for those of you who don't know, is the study of early education and development, which grew out of the earlier phase called EPI. the effective preschool primary education research. And what SEED has demonstrated is that high quality early education benefits all children throughout their lives, particularly those from lower social economic status areas. It also importantly demonstrates that early education isn't just about what happens in preschools, nurseries, and childminders. The seminal importance is that of the home learning environment, the provision that is provided for the child in the home and how the settings work with those families. The home learning environment, the evidence shows, is second only to maternal highest qualification level as the biggest impact on maths and literacy at the age of 11. So it doesn't matter how good your early education provision is, or even your primary school provision, the biggest two factors influencing that child's outcome by the age of 11 and on to 16, although secondary schools do have a bit of a say in that by the time they're 16, is the quality of the home learning environment and mother's maternal qualification levels. There also, interestingly, has been international recognition of the early years foundation stage. England, particularly, the United Kingdom generally, was always seen as a bit of a backwater in terms of early education. Now, internationally, through the principles and values of the EYFS, we are recognised as a force in early education, and many countries come to us to find out more about how those principles and values can be applied. Interestingly, remember that we talked about quasi-markets within the education, the compulsory school age education. In early years, we are more of a pure market with the private, voluntary, independent sector. And there is money to be made in nursery provision, and there are lots of organisations who make considerable profits, but they do so by operating in higher social economic status areas and increasing the differential between provision in wealthier areas and those in more disadvantaged, and those are at risk of getting worse because of current policies. I put a link in the slides, and I'm sure they get shared out to a really interesting radio program. It's quite old now, 2017, 2018. Professor Alison Wolfe looked at the twin track policy of early education and childcare. The program was called, slightly ironically, the Childcare Miracle, because what it evidenced was that actually trying to follow two policies of early education and childcare to allow parents to go out to work means you've had very little impact on either. Maternal employment rates have hardly moved, and the number of children reaching their good levels of development by the age of 5 has increased, but not massively over the period of time of this policy. The one thing I would ask where we do not need is another inquiry into the importance of the first 1,000 days from conception through to. It's my job to read these things, and they say exactly the same as the last one. John, do you just want to flick through the next slide just because it clicks through? These are just a random sample of the reports we've had in the last 10 years from various organisations talking about the importance of the first 1,000 days. We just need to implement policy to meet the recommendations from those. John, please. So, my last slide, what needs to be done? I would say the government has made a good start. Bridget Phillipson has said that early years is her first priority. And for the first time, Stephen Morgan, in the role of the Minister of State, is the Minister of State for early education, not for childcare. If this is an articulation of the rebalancing away from childcare towards early education, then it is to be applauded. But obviously, there's a lot that's just in the title. They do need to work with the sector on policy development and implementation. All too often, and it echoes what has been said by previous presenters, there is a top-down approach, usually in our case from the Treasury. Announcements are made from the Treasury in terms of the number of free hours of eligible entitlement that children can benefit from, with no preparation whatsoever for the impact in terms of supply, capacity, workforce skills, etc. They've got to build from an asset-based community development perspective. Local authorities, with the new policy around the 3,000 primary school classes to be made into nurseries, they've got to do that with the knowledge about what the provision is in their early years provision already. There were damaging situations from Sure Start where new provision was just parachuted into areas with no consideration about what was there, and it didn't work with the sector. They do need to recognise that the home learning, the central importance of the home learning environment, and early education isn't just what happens in nurseries, preschools and childminders, work with families in baby and toddler groups through health visiting circumstances, community venues, etc. Must keep the child and the family at the centre of policy. I'm hearing already local authority leads saying, great, if we can open up a nursery in our school, that will keep that rural primary school open. That is not the role, that is not a child-centred policy about what is best for children and families in those areas. We have a massive recruitment and retention challenge, similar to that's been said at the moment. DfE's own figures is to meet the expansion entitlements they want. We need at least another 40,000 trained members of staff. And currently we're losing huge numbers of experienced staff. So we need to value, reward and respect early educators. And that's as much from David Bell, if you read the report that wasn't published but got shared with the TES, one of his recommendations was the issue of people getting their degrees in early education, the early years teacher status should have QTS, because that is the route to becoming to having a solid career in early education. And finally, it's been mentioned already, but I just needed to put it in there, address and reframe the SEND landscape from early years through schools to further education, recognizing the important initial assessment and support that is done in early years is often overlooked, is never financially supported sufficiently, and needs to be put at the heart of anything which is around making sure we are making inclusive environments. Thank you, John. I think I'm done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I now have the great pleasure of offering a brief summary of the past three speakers. Of course, I've tried my best to pull out the salient points of each of their talks. We began by James, who insisted that systems constrict leaders into behave in ways that not otherwise behave in. He was very emphatic that the issue of curriculum planning and curriculum delivery is a systematic one. He suggests that because we cannot overthrow the system individually, we ought instead to change its rules, and then the system will follow. Then Laura talked to us about a collaborative and compassionate behavioral management model so that we can move away from purely punitive ones. She emphasized the importance of building and maintaining positive relationships between students, between staff. Of course, she emphasized the importance of funding and resources necessary to actualize these desired changes into a reality. Finally, Michael brought a healthy, needed focus on quality early education. He stressed the needed reframing away from purely child's care towards an early education model, which by the changing terms in the new government ministry, hopefully that's an indication of a good direction taken there. He also let us know another cause for optimism that England, the United Kingdom, has a lot of early education expertise around, and we really ought to take advantage of that. Finally, talked about how high quality education positively impacts students, children across their lives, especially those from a lower economic status. However, as we could expect, these provisions are not offered equally across the nation, and they often fall divided across income lines. Thank you very much for the three speakers, James, Laura, and Michael. It is my understanding we now move to the closing statements by Melian, who will then open the floor for a general discussion. Thank you, guys.
You're muted, Melian.
We want to allow time for people in the conference to put forward any quick comments. And I think we have time to do that now. You will be allowed 1 minute to say whatever you want to say, or you can put things in the chat. So is there anybody who wants to make a brief comment now? John will be timing you, but we do want to hear from you.
Melian, we have got half an hour.
Yes,
so
I know.
So
that's why I'm saying
yeah,
it would be very good to hear from anyone else. John, you're going to manage this. Has anyone put up their hands?
I have Carl.
Comment or question in 1 minute.
It's not so much a question, except at the end of what I have to say, but I'm really very impressed by the coverage of what we have done this morning. I did not sleep last night as one of those involved with the planning. I thought this could fall apart. But there's an awful lot there, much more than we can talk about, and we will be producing a report, and that is where I think the strengths will come, and that is where Ron Glatter's plea that we try and influence our Labour government now can be best promoted. I was just with just taking the last speaker and the last section. Well, it is the last speaker. It's Michael's thing on early years. We had Sure Start. It was nationally directed through local authorities and then fell apart and disappeared practically. And early years provision now is big business.
Absolutely.
And is there a way we can say to Parliament, don't just put the budget out there, bids invited? Can we say, local authorities, it's your job. They're your residents. You are the democratic local people. Get a grip on it. As, of course, I'm saying right at the beginning, my talk, it's about schools should not be left to just float out into the atmosphere and be picked up by semi-private groups. It's a local democratic community responsibility to make sure that the education provided for our young people is what we want it to be. My apologies.
That's fine. Melian, do you want me to respond, or do you want me to respond to that?
Yeah. I think it's fair. Yeah. I mean, there's a question, right? Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, Carl. And in many ways, actually, what we have in early years could be a dangerous foreshadowing of what you've all said in terms of the maintained the compulsory education sector. We are a market where the largest provider in this country, which runs about 350, 400 nurseries, is owned by the Canadian Teachers Pension Trust, and takes and as a private wealth organisation and makes huge profits. And I think what it does indicate is that we do need a planned approach to this, because we have a situation. The local authorities have they have a ridiculous responsibility to manage the market, and what their levers are to do that is because private providers will go where the money is. And I think what I would say is our message to government is, we've struggled with universality, and I think this reflects what you said about Sure Start. Sure Start targeted a program in 300 of the most deprived wards when it started, and was having real impacts in terms of the outcomes for children. There was a political desire to then make it across 3,000 wards. Every community should have a Sure Start centre. But the problem with that is you dilute it so much that actually it became problematic in terms of sustaining, and you end up with elements where it wasn't really necessary. And it also became just subject to annual revenues, which during austerity meant they all dissipated and we lost it completely. Message to government would be, you have limited resources. The evidence shows it has most impact on supporting children from disadvantaged areas. Spend your money there, not spreading it across all children going. And the most recent one of that is what you're going to get in schools with breakfast clubs, where actually isn't every child now going to be entitled to have breakfast? Why? Just focus good breakfast on children who need it most in areas of disadvantage. It just seems misguided to me.
Okay. John, is there anyone else?
No, but I wondered, I mean, I've been, like Carl, I've been really impressed by the quality of the contributions this morning. And we framed this as a debate about systemic approaches and systemic change. And very largely, that's what it's been on. There has been amongst case members a sub-debate about the NHS review that's going on. And I wonder, amongst the people on the call is John Fowler. And I don't know whether, John, whether you would be prepared to comment on whether a review of education in the education system in a similar way to the NHS review would be a helpful thing.
Well, I think I told you, John, I'm a skeptical about whether it would be of value, because I think there is, first of all, a need for the current administration to actually get a grip of what's going on. I mean, we've heard a lot about problems with early years and the new early years grant expansion, problems about SEND. You've got to stabilise what we have currently before one can begin to fix the foundations, which in a sense was the Darcy report. It helped with the NHS because you're a whole body rather than, as has been pointed out, with the education of a fragmented system where there isn't any command or control from the centre, which there can or will be from the NHS. Now, my hunch is that's what the government will do. They will try and the new government will try and actually institute with its legislation coming up a bit of a command and control over the system. Now, whether that's good or bad, I don't know. I mean, come back in 2 months' time when this this children's wellbeing bill is published, and we can discuss it again. Anyhow, back to you, John.
Okay, thank you. I've got Zena Brabazon, please.
Thank you. It's been fascinating. I really have enjoyed listening to people who are so expert. But to add my own thing, I think one of the things that hasn't really been talked about is the actual funding system itself, which is actually based on children as commodities, as far as I can see. I've been around the education system one way or another for donkey's years, and from the Education Reform Act onwards, children have had a value. And when you have a value, you have a market and a price. And certainly what we're seeing in London now is that this is collapsing because there aren't enough children to go around. So while the system could sort of muddle along and not look like a market so much because there were enough children within the system, the loss of children in the system reveals all the cracks, all the fissures, all the fragmentation, the parallel systems with the academies, which the local authorities, we don't have the powers to really control. So when you run a system like that, as James said, you have to start by looking at the system and the money that we cannot sustain schools. So now what we're looking at across London is schools closing, and the marketisation has been in the early years since the nursery vouchers, which I don't know if anybody else remembers that fiasco. And what we've had since then, I don't know, Michael, if you agree, we've had the vouchers without the vouchers. We've had the system, but without the bits of paper. And the whole system, in my view, needs a total review because we cannot fund schools based on bums on seats. It's just perverse. It means you can never focus on children. We're always thinking about the money. And then when the money is going up the system, like you've talked about with these obscene salaries that Warwick writes about all the time, then we really have to take the system apart and start again. That's my view. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I've got Tom.
Yeah, just a quick comment from me. I think it's based on an awful lot of what was spoken about today. It would appear that issues around poverty are possibly the biggest issue that faces us all, educationally, outcomes in the workplace, well-being, and I think we need to focus on issues that alleviate poverty as a first instance. I know it doesn't answer all the questions, because there are some disadvantaged students who are not in poverty, but the vast majority are. And alleviating poverty, we know, increases educational outcomes, increases life chances, and also narrows the gap between, if you like, the haves and the have-nots of society. So that would be my big takeaway from today. I think it's something I've thought about lots over the past few years, and it's just it's such a thorny issue. It's such a simple answer to such a complicated problem. But we really need to look at ways of alleviating poverty to lift people out of poor educational outcomes, poor educational experiences, and poor life chances.
Okay.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wishes to say something? Comment? Kate?
Kate? So I don't know if you can see my hand because
Yes.
I can't find the hand up function. But as I've been a member of CASE for many years and very much on the back benches, but the inequalities and the iniquities of the system are just breathtaking, from seeing the national curriculum being introduced and the stress and the devaluation of education as a process where children were valued and teachers were given autonomy to teach and help children grow, being eroded. One of our local schools was became an academy, and it was the head teacher embezzled the funds, and this brilliant school, which had a special behaviour unit, was closed. That has never been reopened, and the children were bused elsewhere. And this as it is all about fragmentation, disintegration, and big money taking over the education system. And I just look and think, how was this allowed to happen? How was our education system hijacked and privatised? And the democratisation that CASE has been fighting for, talking about Joan Sallis at the school gate saying, "Let us in." And those barriers have just been increased further and further to just prevent parents and people involved in the community from having any meaningful say in how their children are educated and what resources are put in and how they're spent. And I really hope this government is not going to just tinker around the edges and do the yes minister answer, open another inquiry, but use the evidence that's there, that all these wonderful speakers have produced the evidence to show how our education system is being destroyed and the life opportunities of the most deprived children with it, by not, again, as one of the speakers said, change the rules. So that, I mean, it's just a plea from the heart. See my children and grandchildren going through this iniquitous system. We really need to stop the rot and hopefully make a change from now. And, the Sure Start programme showed it can be done, and that generational shift will go on, and continue to improve further, other generations of children coming through that system. Thank you.
Okay, Louise is coming in.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I was inspired by Kate's comments and, of course, by all the speakers that came before. I don't want to ramble too much, but I want to share some personal reflections which are not representative of CASE. I sign under these as my own thoughts and not CASE as an organization. But when Kate, for example, asks how this could have happened, right? When we ask ourselves, how did this happen? I am drawn to what James said about systemic changes. This is not a phenomenon that has existed only in education in the United Kingdom from the 1980s to the present. This has been the reality of what we call the West since the 80s, right? The general zeitgeist has been of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and neoliberalism and the gradual privatization or corporatization of what were once public systems, right? We've had the overall death of Keynesianism. Now, personally, I think, I guess I'm more politically radical, I think, than perhaps other people in this call, but the common issue here is the newest rendition of capitalism and our ability to change that systematically as a campaign for state education, as said before, is quite limited, but there are points to hope, right? Because this way of organizing our society and our economy is a figment of history. It has come into being and it will pass away. There's no necessity for things to be like this forever. And I would close this passionate and convoluted rant with a recommendation of a book called Capitalism Realism, which interestingly maps out how we find ourselves currently and how we have a hard time collectively thinking up alternatives. But it talks about this, growing corporatization of public goods like education, like health. So let us not despair and understand that each in our meaningful ways, things have changed and they will change, right? Change is the only constant. The only problem is that they can also get worse. We need to make sure that they get better instead of worse. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Okay, Alan Gerbit.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, I relate to the capitalism perspective because I've lived in a selective education area all my life. I went to school in the 1970s, and I can uncategorically say that nothing has changed. We're still segregating children at the age of 10. And it's having a detrimental impact on recruitment into our public services, lifelong opportunities, well-being, mental health well-being. I'm a mental health nurse by profession, and we've got a huge reluctance to do anything about it. You know, I've challenged this till the cows come home. And what I found is that privilege and disadvantage replicates itself. Those that have benefited from the system won't speak up about it, and those that fail to get into the system become fearful of speaking up about it. I see it as a capitalist problem. I'm quite radical in my thinking as well, and I think it's quite deliberate. And I don't think it's that far removed from the marketisation of education either. We have national reports on suicide. We've seen a rise in children dying around the age of 10 and 11, particularly where I live in a coastal area. And there's no data collected on that. I've challenged the NHS on it. We've talked about the NHS. They don't want to know, essentially, because it's a really tough nut to crack. And it's, to me, I think much more needs to be done, and it definitely needs to be some national data collected on the psychological impacts of the 11 plus, for example, and there needs to be people that are much braver in challenging this. And I'm particularly frustrated that, you know, I've been involved with groups such as, you know, campaigns to end the 11 plus. I've also been involved in this group. But from where I am, it's a very isolating position, and there's lots of children that are suffering, and nothing's been done about it. And I think this group is absolutely brilliant, by the way, and I've got a lot from it, but I'd just like to see much more done. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Does anybody else want to make a comment? Ask a question?
Can I pose a question? I mean, just picking up from both Alan and Louise, is just why we do persist. We all, you know, all of us understand what's wrong and have done for decades, but we persist. There's something. So my perspective is that everybody has had an education, and that makes us all experts on education. The last education minister who had any sort of training in education was Estelle Morris. So we have people who are not professionals, who haven't studied in the field, who are making the key decisions, but they all had an education, and whether they enjoyed it or not determines whether how they then frame the education for the children of this generation. And whether so, you know, is that the reason that we persist with doing the things? I forget who quoted the Einstein quote about madness is doing the same thing again and again, even though you know nothing is changing. Ron? Ron?
Needs to unmute.
Yeah.
Ron, can you unmute yourself?
Tell you what, I'll go to Louise while you're finding the button. Louise.
I would like to give a potential answer to your question, John, though I appreciate we might want to hear from other people as well. Briefly, I think we should always judge a system by what it produces instead of what it fails to produce. What does the English education system produce objectively? It produces an incredibly unequal society. Since the 70s, it has produced increasingly income and wealth inequality. We are reaching levels of wealth inequality. And by wealth, I think wealth inequality is a better metric than income, because a lot of people have assets that aren't income, right? but levels of wealth inequality that are comparable to pre-French Revolution levels, right? So all of this is talked about by French economist Thomas Piketty. So in terms of what the English education system does produce, it produces, I mean, I dare say, a caste society, right, of haves and has-nots, and perpetuates it. So if you consider the fact that power tends to centralize unless it is challenged, the English education system is not failing because it's doing exactly what it's intended to do. It's not that we're insisting on error. I'm sorry, my dog's having a bit of a moment. It's not that we're insisting on error. We are insisting on doing exactly what the system's designed to do. Mass education has never been educated for the masses, right? Even since 1944, it's just been a way to get a pliable workforce. We never treated the average Joe as we did the aristocracy with their private tutors or whatever. So I think I'm really sorry, but for me it's just class analysis. I can't simplify it any other way. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Sorry. Quick response would be, it sounds to me that you've gone from the optimistic, the system will fall, to the cynical, it's how it's, it's actually working exactly how it should.
It can fall provided we don't fall prey to false conscience, right? I think a lot of people now live their lives, as Steinbeck once wrote, as disgruntled, temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? A lot of people vote and behave as if they occupy a social class position that they don't. And so they act against their own interests. And this is ideologically programmed, again, in the education system, which teachers must be apolitical, which I find very interesting.
Okay. Ron, are you able to come in now?
Ron, are you able to unmute? Don't know that he's doesn't seem to be able to do that. Is there any? I'm sure he'd have something to say too. We could find.
Just going to see if anybody else is able to come in. I mean, I don't know if there's. I know all the speakers have had their opportunity to speak.
Philip wants to talk.
Philip, thank you.
Hi, just in answer to what Louise was saying about what the English education system produces. It produces loads of data, doesn't it? And the more data it produces, rather than actually, the powers that be being more secure in their judgments about what we need to be doing, there seems to be a growing insecurity and the need for even more data investigation and more data production. Teachers spend an awful lot of their time producing this stuff, and students in schools spend an awful lot of time working on production of data. If you look at schools where there are up to 6 data drops a year in the big maths, there's about possibly 1 million data drops going on every year, with 200,000 teachers spending much of their term time with their students producing data that is educationally useless when it comes to supporting students who are struggling with a curriculum and can't access it. So an awful lot of time is spent in schools doing nothing of any educational importance whatsoever. And that is a massive problem. And what I kind of worry about, and I know I didn't finish my talk earlier on, but when I worry particularly about, what I'm heartened about, I suppose, is that I often wondered what kind of residual memory there was in the system, about how things could be different. And meetings like this fill me with hope, because not everyone is just my age who's talking, and I'm working in a union, I'm working with lots of young people who are very, very passionate about change. And that is always heartening and fills me with enthusiasm, because I believe in the transformative power of education. Even though when I was a teacher, I found I couldn't really do much about it when I was in it. One of the things I am a little bit concerned about, I suppose, in terms of system challenges, is kind of cracking that kind of nexus between what would existed up to this year between the DFE, the EEF, and the Oak National Academy, and how powerful a corporation, an incorporation that was of of a kind of orthodoxy in our approach to teaching. That bothers me, and I worry about them. I worry about Oak National Academy a lot. I worry that then they're not really that well used actually in the profession. There's a much more of a pick and mix approach to Oak going on than we realise. But I don't think they're dormant. I think there's a role for them, and I worry about how Oak will be, kind of turbocharged by what might be a big AI agenda coming up, which might well promote this something I was talking about earlier, which is this kind of one-way model of teaching, and I don't want it to be like that. I worry about that. I worry about this, the framework content, and the kind of this kind of agenda of prescriptive teaching that is so not what I came into education to do. So I'll stop it there.
Thank you. And at least two significant players who are in Oak are members of the curriculum review group, which is also troubling.
Yeah. Matt has just been appointed. Yeah.
Carl.
I was just thinking about reviews of education, and I share John Fowler's dismissal of it, really. The number of royal commissions and inquiries and reviews that are carried out, and they are published, and that's the job done. It's kicked into the long grass from there. The report is delivered, there are proposals as to what should happen. The next step doesn't happen. I know of someone who was involved with Lammy's review of black young people being disproportionately put in prison, and he was part of the data gathering. At the end of the review, he was shocked that the team was just disbanded, and all the statements are there, but there isn't the action to follow, nor any sense of an investment to fund action that would follow. And I think if we're thinking about action following from our morning discussing the whole business, we've got to think really hard about where we dig in and where our elbows can make a difference, and who we should speak to, and how urgently, and how much follow-up we would need to do in order to get the balls rolling. It's a tough job.
Thank you.
So, do you want me to?
Well, I was just, but we've still got a few minutes. I
just want to say a few things as well.
Sorry, all I was going to ask was whether there's maybe a data professional on the call who'd like to respond to Philip about the role of data in education. I don't know, is anybody there? No? Okay. Dave? No. Okay.
Apologies, I missed that. I wandered into the other room.
Okay. Sorry, Dave. There was a response. Philip Foyle was saying about the role of data in education and how much there's so much data generated, but doesn't necessarily make any difference to what happens in schools. I just wonder how you feel the role of data impacts on the system, if it does, in the classroom.
Well, I always tend to stay fairly neutral on this, but my former colleague Sam Sims, he did a very interesting piece of analysis. It was focused on primary schools rather than secondary, but his view was that the change from half term to half term in pupil attainment was indistinguishable from the amount of measurement error in the tests being used, and as a result, a large part of this activity was unnecessary. I'll dig out the link and I'll put it in the channel.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Melian.
Well, I just wanted to thank all the speakers, but I wanted to say that this conference was to bring together the broad spectrum of problems that we have in education and to put forward a new agenda. And that's what we're going to be working on. And I agree with Carl about public inquiries as well as reports from Public Accounts Committee, Education Select Committee. They're very well researched. There's lots of information, but they're completely ignored and nothing happens as a result. So we have to make a difference case as a result of this excellent selection of information from all our speakers. I just want to thank them all, to look at the whole of the education system, although there are clearly areas that we haven't covered. Two big ones of which are Ofsted, which virtually controls what happens in schools, and the funding situation. But everyone here has produced other thoughts, and I just wanted to bring back to what we're really talking about, which is the education of children and young people. And children and young people often don't even get mentioned, let alone being asked what they want in their education. They have a right to an education which builds on their interests, which develops their talents, which gives them a wide range of experience, both artistic and cultural, which doesn't divide them or segregate it. Children are segregated within schools, let alone in the system. They're put in sets or put in different groups, or they're categorized, they're given labels, and all of those have an impact on their own emotional feelings and the way in which they operate in schools. And instead of looking in the issue that Laura mentioned about behavior, which people are saying getting worse, it's because the system is not providing what children need. It is not supporting them. It doesn't really care about them, I have to say. And we need to change that. We need to use some of the words that have been mentioned in the course of this debate, which is about listening, about collaboration, about compassion, respect, looking at what the values of education should be, and also looking at other countries. There's a great resistance, it feels to me, although not by the Education Select Committee, to look at what other countries are doing. And other countries treat their children better, provide a much more broad and balanced education. And there are lots of examples that we could go to for change, which would impact much more than just changing bits. Now, we particularly, and I just want to thank the speakers, really have been excellent. We particularly wanted to look at a broad spectrum, because too often, as the Labour Party has just started, they've started an inquiry on the curriculum. You look at one part, but every part of the education system impacts on everything else. And every part impacts on children and their experience. And what we want is children to have an exciting education, one that really listens to them and develops they already have talents. And we want the system to explore those talents and develop them and not divide them. And we want to have to provide a range of experiences, most of which have disappeared from our schools, of artistic, cultural, and exciting events for children to take part in. We have a divided system in the sense of the academies and the maintained system. And that really needs to be brought together and looked at, because it's very costly. The whole issue about funding is, where is the money being spent? And we had several examples, particularly in relation to the management of the academy system. We have three tiers. We have the multi-academy trusts, we have the regional commissioners, and then we have the DFE, and then we have local authorities. This is unmanageable and very expensive. And as a result, schools themselves, many thousands of schools, are currently in deficit, which is not helpful both to teachers or to children. So I just want to bring us back to the importance of thinking about and listening to what children want and need in their education. They're being done to they are not being listened to. So CASE will make every effort to take everything that has been said today, all the suggestions for change. We have a full recording of this conference. We will look at everything that's been put into the chat, and also people who have spoken in the debate. And we will pull together a document which we will certainly be taking to government and publicising in every possible area. And any ideas or suggestions that any of you have to perpetuate this, to publicise it, we would be really grateful. And do look at our website. We have there also a forum, part of the website, where you can put articles or anything, make any statements of interest to contribute to the debate, because this has to be an ongoing debate and we have to influence this government. I did, in fact, invite Stephen Morgan to this conference, but he said he was unable to come, but we will go back to him. We did speak to him some time ago, Case, when he was in his former role as Shadow Minister for Schools. So we'll do everything we can, and every contacts that you can give us or any ideas that you can put forward, please do so that we can develop a major debate across the country with everybody to change the system in the ways that we all want. So thank you very much, everyone, for spending your morning with us. I hope you've all found it useful. Everybody who's contributed has made very important and valid points, and we will be using all of those in everything we do. Thank you. I think we will work together with all of you to make a difference.
Thank you, everybody.
Make a difference.
Well said. Yeah. Thank you. Could I ask the core? So that's the formal end. Could I ask the core case group just to stay on the line for a minute, just while thank you all for coming. Travel safely.
And any final comments, put them quickly in the chat before we go. All right, Thomas.
All right. I shall stop the recording at that point.